So we've been talking about it a lot, and indeed the conversations around the fact that, well, Brexit really hasn't lived up not only to its expectations, but even now, 2 years on, sort of almost at this point of Brexit happening, even the Brexiteers are terrified and are trying to push Boris Johnson to do more and go faster. Hence why Jacob Rees-Mogg has been the Brexit benefits minister. And trust me, I'm looking forward to whatever nonsense he publishes, probably in a couple of months' time, to say, look at this Brexit benefit that we could do. Again, kind of weird that, these benefits almost aren't as obvious and maybe weren't even talked about, should we say, back in the 2016 referendum. But we did say that back in the day a lot. And of course, now the Ukraine war, especially, has invalidated a lot of the Brexit thinking that Britain could go out and do everything alone. But in terms of, when you look at sanctioning, security, trade, food supply, we need Europe now more than ever. And this whole idea of being absent from that is completely false. And the whole idea of we would leave and the rest of the EU would somehow follow, again, hasn't really turned out that way. Or the EU would miraculously collapse. Again, hasn't really turned out that way. If anything, us leaving did make the EU a lot more united in a lot more areas, because, again, we were a roadblock in a lot of areas. So once we went, they were able to do a lot more stuff. But hey-ho. And it is indeed, as I keep on telling people, it is really critical that we do get back into the EU, even if it's just rejoining the single market customs union to begin with. That's fantastic. It puts us back on the path to rejoining and eventually regaining our seat at the table. So, of course, how are all these intertwined? Because the levelling up, Brexit, and the Ukraine war are all intertwined in a very, very interesting way at the moment. Very, very interesting way. So we're going to go over to this piece from the Byline Times with the title of How Levelling Up, Brexit, and the Ukraine War Are Intertwined. But before you do that, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a organization link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, buy me coffee. And as always, their YouTube memberships are open as well. And of course, thank you very much to all those people who do help support the channel. So, on with this. So, as we said, this comes from the Byline Times. So, the latest sanction to hit Russia has been heralded as the most significant yet, as Vladimir Putin's forces do continue their bombardment of Ukraine. The UK has announced that it will wean itself off Russian oil imports by the end of this year, joined again by the US, which is banning Russian oil, gas, and energy. The EU does intend to stop its consumption of Russian oil fuels by the end of the decade. The energy, of course, was seen one of the final frontiers in the economic countersurge against Russia. The West leans on Russian oil and gas imports, significantly more than 40% of the UK's imports from Russia. And it was feared that this energy reliance would continue to pay for Putin's war machine. The West has effectively cancelled this credit line, compounding a raft of sanctions that have now blacklisted Russian oligarchs, including Putin's inner sanctum, and a mark of new economic Cold War between Russia and the West. Russia's commercial clout, although often overstated, is still significant, and these sanctions will be felt at home. Lenders across the Western world will have cautioned that energy prices will rise further as we transition away from Russia. The Resolution Foundation has forecast that the typical UK household income will fall by at least £1,000 this year once the effect of inflation is accounted for. And the biggest is the real term of falling incomes in over 50 years. The immediate prospectus of the domestic economy, however, therefore, is seen to be markedly damaged from Boris Johnson's own grand promise during his own 2021 Conservative Party conference speech, during which he foresaw the return of the high-wage, high-skill, high-productivity economy. This promise will seem very particularly distant from those who will be hit the hardest, notably in those neglected areas of the country that the Conservatives managed to claim just in the 2019 general election. These very places that Johnson has promised to level up. And it is expected that more than 2.2 million households with children will struggle to pay their electricity and gas bills when the energy price cap in April, according to the Fuel Poverty Coalition, rises from 74% in 2019, when around 1.2 million children were living in fuel poverty. Indeed, an economic freeze with Russia will hit the UK's remaining manufacturing heartlands. The region that imported or exported the most goods to Russia in 2020 was the West Midlands, with its exports worth around £441 million and 20.6% of the total UK goods export to Russia. The West Midlands was followed by the South East, excluding London, which exported goods worth of a total of £332 million, and of course the North West, totaling in at least £226 million. The goods exported of 2.6 billion outweigh the service exports of at least 1.7 billion to Russia in the year of ending of September of 2021 by at least 61.6%, down to 38.4%, led by the export of cars, which represented at least 14% of all good exports. During this period, good exports to Russia did increase by 10%, more, or at least in money terms, 240 million, compared to the previous year where service exports fell by 11%. In fact, the economic relationship between Britain and Russia conjures up images of luxury property deals and high-end legal services, or a mutual trade in goods more intertwined than is commonly imagined. In the year ending of September of 2021, the UK imports from Russia were at least 11.6 billion, an increase of over 43%, or coming to a total of 3.5 billion, compared with the past previous 12 months of £10 billion in goods and just £793 million in services. The UK's manufacturing sector and automotive sector in particular, therefore, face a moment of jeopardy as we divest from Russia. In 2016, the automotive sector employed at least 159,000 people here in the UK, with a further at least 238,000 within the wider supply chain. But of course, before Brexit, its productivity was 40% higher than the other manufacturing sectors and at least 80% higher than the economy as a whole, generating at least £40.1 billion worth of exports and £18.3 billion to the EU. It was estimated that at least 34% of the automotive employment is based in the West Midlands, by the far highest concentration in the UK, a region that contains 8 of those red wall seats that flipped from Labour to the Conservatives at the last general election. And of course, the West Midlands is the engine of British manufacturing. But thanks to Brexit, it is now, and of course now the Ukrainian war, the region's economic future seems uncertain. The UK's departure from the EU involved navigating the tension between the immigration and trade. And as per the rules of the EU single market, if we sought to end freedom of movement, then trade would become more difficult. This isolationist worldview won the protracted debate from at least 2016 to 2019, sacrificing the free trade in exchange for greater control over immigration. As a result, manufacturing firms have been forced to adjust to these new terms of trade and have been sufficiently and disproportionately hit by those in the automotive sector. Indeed, vehicle makers traditionally operated, of course, on the just-in-time, the basis of importing components on the globe soon before they are even required. The trade barriers imposed by Brexit threaten this very system. And 9 in 10 firms in the car industry told the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders that the costs measured in time and resources had increased as a result of leaving the EU. Undoubtedly, the industry will be facing the additional costs and complexity costs which will generate and have to be absorbed and maintained to maintain competitiveness, the SMMT chief executive Mike Hull has said. Prior to Brexit, the EU had accounted for at least 56% of the UK's car exports in terms of volume. The great promise, of course, of Brexit was that our departure would open up new emerging markets for trade. By their very nature, these markets are not liberal democracies. It seems as though Brexit has coincided with a moment in history when our economic and political alliances with European countries are now more important than ever. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss is currently in the US, arguing that the UK and that the Western world should reduce its strategic economic reliance on authoritarian regimes. Standing outside, of course, the single market with non-European trade looking increasingly precarious, Brexit seems to have left domestic firms with noticeably less limited horizons. As the ruble continues to crash, restricting the international spending of the Russian firms and potentially leaves UK exporters now with a multi-million pound black hole blowout out of the side of the economy by the Ukrainian war, while our trade with Europe continues to falter. However, the economic impact of the Ukraine war is not contained to the manufacturing sector. Due to Brexit, the UK did introduce a new scheme that has allowed employers to sponsor seasonal workers, to many in the agricultural sector for a limited period. This scheme obviously capped out at 30,000, with an extra 10,000 visas available if needed. A Pick for Britain scheme was initially launched to try and incentivize the young British people to fill these seasonal labour shortages on farms. But at least 88 people who registered for work in 2020, only 2 actually stayed on for the entire season. The majority left after their first day. This is where Brexit and, of course, the Ukraine crisis closely intertwine. Due to the end of freedom of movement between the UK and the rest of Europe, workers based in the EU now find it comparably easier to find jobs close to home, with high demand for seasonal workers now across Europe, with Germany now a favoured destination. EU workers have therefore decided against making the trip across the Channel. Hence, the non-EU workers from the majority of seasonal workers in the UK, with 2/3, some 20,000 of seasonal workers coming from Ukraine in 2021, and 8%, over 2,000, from Russia. It is now unclear how this war will change the balance of the seasonal staff. Those fleeing Ukraine may elect to try and apply for the scheme out of sheer desperation, as has been encouraged by the Home Office. However, while those other visa routes are ostensibly free, it does cost at least £244 to be able to apply for the seasonal worker scheme, while the visa holder must travel alone without family members. In the grand scheme of European history, the health of the UK seasonal worker scheme is not of an acute importance. However, if the number of incoming workers from Ukraine dwindles, this will inevitably impact British farms. And there is already suffering from the trade friction and worker shortages created by Brexit. It is thought that the majority of farmers did vote to leave the EU. And of course, ironically, Brexit is also being blamed in some quarters for how the UK's slow response to sanctioning Russian oligarchs. Sources have told Politico that Theresa May's government did accept amendments in the House of Lords tabled by a senior lawyer, David Packard, that this, as Packard put it at the time, beefed up UK laws to ensure that they provided for procedural fairness for those being sanctioned, strengthening the remedial measures that those who are being sanctioned could take to ensure that their sanctions imposed on those individuals were done so in a proportionate measure, and they were made sure that they were in accordance with the human rights principles. And though Brexit did try and promise to try and slash government bureaucracy, the EU has acted far more swiftly than the UK during the Ukraine crisis, sanctioning far more Russian oligarchs and offering exponentially more support to asylum seekers. While at least more than 2 million people have now fled Ukraine, the UK has granted fewer than 800 visas to those in need. And while the burden must be carried by its neighbouring states such as Poland. And of course, as Peter Jukes has documented in these pages, the fomenting Euroscepticism, hoping to try and destabilize and incapacitate the Western alliance, has been a very long-standing ambition of Vladimir Putin. The war in Ukraine, the realization of Putin's geopolitical ambitions, therefore cannot be separated from Brexit. This has to be seen on a domestic soil, with the Kremlin insiders seen to sweet-talk the potential compromised members of the Brexit establishment alongside efforts abroad. In France, in the mid-2010s, Marine Le Pen's National Front required funds from its political campaign, and it found its treasure chest in the form of a £9.4 million loan from the Bank of First Czech. which was also under the personal ownership of a Russian financer. After receiving this financial backing, Le Pen has been broadly supportive of the foreign policy positions taken by Moscow, describing the rigged election in 2014, formalizing the Russian annexation of Crimea, as indisputable, and also vowing to take France out of NATO as if she wins the French presidency later this year. Le Pen even visited Russia to meet President Putin in her final stages of a 2017 election campaign, saying, "The Vladimir Putin of 5 years ago is not exactly that of today." Le Pen has said in recent days in an attempt to try and explain her past ties to Russia. Similarly, of course, in Hungary, President Viktor Orban's government has established close ties with Moscow. This has resulted in the relocation of the International Investment Bank from Moscow to Budapest. And unlike the rest of Europe, Hungary has moved towards greater reliance on Russian energy imports and, in exchange for its loyalty, has received at least $10 billion in a credit line from Moscow. Mirroring Le Pen, Orban has also been keen to distance himself from Putin since the invasion of Ukraine, saying that the unity of the EU is paramount. "We condemn the Russian attack," Orban added, saying all of Europe should be working for peace. And of course, operating in the shadows, Putin has planted the seeds of political discontent in Europe by sowing rogue anti-EU campaigns. However, with the Russian president's aggression now manifesting in its true form through repression, and the wreckage, his path into Europe has now been slammed shut. As the West and the world now unify around the EU and NATO, the UK remains completely aloof, the only one to have fallen for Putin's trap. And that is the big key situation, I think, here. A lot of people are really asking. And a lot of people, when this is brought up in Parliament, especially the Conservatives, are very unkeen to actually answer that question of, was there interference in the 2016 referendum? There is a court case going right through now to suggest that, look, we have these 4 documents all saying there was significant Russian interference in the 2016 referendum and that it should be basically invalid. It should invalidate the referendum. I don't know what will happen with that court case, of course. We'll have to see. But nevertheless, depending on what happens with it, I will bring you the news of what happens with it, definitely. But needless to say, like I say, it's been a long one today. But as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button on your way out. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can, buy me a coffee. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all next time.